He found the kitten when the garden still slept and dusk had not yet unclasped itself from the sky. It stepped like a small, polite thing, carrying a folded scrap between its teeth. The paper was stained with rain and old ink. He had grown careful since his wife's absence, watering the same row of roses, speaking to the fence as if it were a neighbor, counting days by the sounds of the house. The kitten waited on the path, patient as a quiet verdict. When he leaned down, the scrap unfolded, an inked loop of a vine with 3 leaves and a single curled blossom. The vine his mother had trained along the kitchen lattice and used to mark promises. He felt a hush, a tightening under the ribs, a sensation like the first cool of autumn on the tongue. The garden smelled of damp earth and rosemary. A hinge somewhere let out a slow, familiar creak. The kitten's eyes were steady without hunger, only a serious insistence as if it carried not a thing but an instruction. In that waiting hour he understood, without knowing how, that his ordered life had been touched and would not be the same. By the time morning learned how to climb his fence, Eli was already halfway across the garden with a watering can in one hand and a memory in the other. He moved with the deliberate economy of a man who had learned to fit his days into measured motions. The rose bushes trimmed on Tuesdays, the kettle on at 9, the photograph on the mantel dusted on Thursdays. The house behind him wore the quiet that follows good manners, curtains drawn like polite heads bowed, the clock in the hall marking hours like small, steady heartbeats. Once, when love sat in the chair by the window, the house sang with a fullness that made windows glow. Now it kept silence, as if listening for the right moment to speak. He was a man of mid-sized regrets, the sort that do not take up much room on a shelf, but sit always where you might look for them. He had been a husband in the manner of small, steady things, tending, listening, learning the temperature of another soul by the way she folded parsley. When she left in that slow, precise way that some departures arrange themselves, the house learned a new grammar. Eli learned to address absent conversations, to leave one cup on the table as if someone might return to it. Grief in his life had not arrived like a storm, but like a winter breeze that kept finding its way into a seam. It wore at edges colored days a little paler and taught him a strange thrift with joy. The garden was his chosen refuge and his witness. It had been planted at better times with the intention of binding memory to living things. His mother's vine by the lattice, the rosemary that had come with the first house, an apple tree that had once been small enough to sit beneath. Each plant carried a ledger of small obligations. Water at dawn, cut the dead wood, pinch a blossom for the kitchen. And in tending them, Eli kept an account of his own continuance. The vine his mother had trained, the one with the 3 leaves and a curled blossom, had been imprinted on him the way songs settle into the throat. It taught in its patient way that promises could be coaxed into growth if given sun and a steady hand. Yet the cat did not appear by design. The kitten stepped into this ordered sphere without explanation. It did not seek to be noticed with clamor, but with the plain strategy of creatures who know patience. It came as creatures come who have no concept of calendar time. An interruption, but not rude, more like a punctuation mark, small, necessary, and oddly grave. Eli saw at once that it was no ordinary intruder. The creature carried intent in the way it held the scrap. Its behavior announced the presence of a mind at work. It sat and waited. It let Eli come to it. It revealed without ceremony the folded piece of paper. There was no mewing for food, no rubbing for human attention, only the steady, businesslike delivery of a thing. Eli remembered the first time his mother taught him to read a plant. She had knelt in the kitchen doorway with flour on her hands and said, "A vine will tell you what it needs if you listen." He had been a boy then, small knees in the dust, pressing a leaf between 2 fingers as if to examine a coin. The vine had curled like a hand taking his, and she had smiled at him as if he were a small miracle. The image came back now with a clarity that made his chest ache. The kitchen lattice, the vine climbing like a slow sentence, the way his mother would mark promises with a knot of string tied around a twig, and tuck the memory into the plant's shadow. Those domestic rites had felt trivial at the time. Now they seemed like a language he had been born to forget, and suddenly to remember. There were other marks in the garden that catalogued his life. A rusted watering can with a dent in the lip, left by a storm 3 summers ago. A half-buried key that he had once dug up for reasons he could not fully recall. And near the back fence, a stone that had been placed there on the day his son had planted saplings and stamped his name in the mud. Eli's hands knew where each thing lived. His memory folded around them like a well-worn glove. The vine was a small, stubborn narrator among these objects. Its leaves held stories of endurance, and its blossom had in it the idea that some promises could bloom long after the voices that made them had gone. He lived with a certain gentleness toward small things. His days were calibrated to hold the least possible surprise. The town around him moved with the diluted drama of long familiarity. A postman who whistled tunelessly, a grocer who offered the same smile every Thursday, neighbors who exchanged weather instead of histories. There had been a time when Eli would have wandered into town to argue with windmills of hope. Now he preferred the slow geometry of the garden. Inside the house, the rooms kept their own quiet rituals. A radio sat on the shelf for company, and the television, though rarely on, was tuned to channels that showed the world at an unemotional distance. It was there to remind him that life still unfolded beyond his gate. Even so, the arrival of the kitten and the scrap broke a seam he had thought well mended. It did not shatter his world with drama. It unsettled it with curiosity. Curiosity in a man like Eli is not idle. It is a particular kind of tool, one used for untangling knots. He had learned to pry gently at the edges of things and to examine the threads of a life as one might unpick stitches to see what lay beneath. When the scrap unfurled and revealed the looping ink of the vine, a small weathered thing he recognized, Eli's hands trembled not from fear but from a sense of being summoned. He took the scrap inside and laid it on the kitchen table as if a map had been placed there. It was not only the symbol but the way the ink had bled into the paper. Someone had handled it in rain, or perhaps had wept over it. The edges were softened by use. Papers speak when we learn their language. A folded corner might signify urgency. An ink blot may mark a hand that shook. A crease can hint at journeys taken. Eli read the scrap slowly, the way one reads the label of a medicine bottle, aware that the syllables might change the dosage of his days. The vine stood in the center like a cipher. No name, no date, only the symbol, and beneath it, a faint trace of handwriting in the margins, loops and crossbars that suggested a hurried hand. There was also the matter of the kitten itself. It did not behave like a stray afraid of human kindness. It possessed the composure of an emissary. It followed him without intrusion, in that precise balletic way animals have when they know they have fulfilled a task. When he opened the door, it sat by the threshold as if waiting permission. The house smelled of old paper and tea, and in the doorway it seemed to breathe the two in as if taking stock. When he bent to pick it up, the creature did not wriggle away. It allowed him the closeness of human fingers and the warmth of an old sweater, and yet its trust was not simple. It held its own kind of dignity, an animal's recognition that the animal had been placed into a human story. That story threaded back to a name not spoken aloud: Miriam. Eli did not say the name much anymore. Saying it aloud felt like opening a wound for the sake of watching the edges curl. Miriam had been the woman who taught him how to braid rosemary into tidy bundles for the winter, who left small notes inside kitchen drawers, who would tuck a hand into his as one tucks a letter into a book. She had left a year ago with a silence that took shape slowly and with surgical care, leaving behind the curl of a scarf and a door that would not hold the same weight of laughter. Her absence had become a topography in his life, a place he visited sometimes, as one visits an old grave to check on the weeds. The scraps vine was the vine of Miriam's mother, Eli's mother-in-law, an emblem she used to mark things worth keeping. When Miriam had first told him about it, she had laughed and said it was superstition, but held his hand feelingly, as if to bind belief. The vine in that household had been used to mark promises, to remind each other of small contracts of care. "We will gather at dusk," the vine would mean, or "remember the beige scarf." It was a domestic hieroglyph that made memory portable. Eli's life since had been a ledger of reminders and quiet penances. He had been good at routine. He had been poor at surprises. The scrap suggested that someone else remembered a ledger too. It suggested that a promise or a message disguised as one had been put in motion. A scrap of paper delivered by a kitten. The odds of coincidence tightened like a string. Eli's curiosity did what curiosity does. It nudged a locked door to see what light lay behind it. He searched the house for signposts. There was a box of letters in the attic, letters that Miriam and he had once exchanged in the small, delicious privacy of early marriage. He rifled through them with cautious hands, placing each one on the floor like a small creature to be observed. The letters were warm with ordinary affections. Recipes tucked into the margins. Complaints about a leaky pipe. Lists of errands written in ink that smudged with habitual care. There were photographs, too. An autumn picnic, Miriam laughing with a stray leaf in her hair. Miriam and his son planting a tree. He handled each image with the sense of a man trying not to make too much of what was, in truth, already large. Outside, the garden kept its honest business. The rosemary had pushed new growth despite winter's lean, and the vine near the lattice had shown a stubborn bud that would not be told by season when to appear. Plants have their own stubbornness. They do not keep human clocks. Eli knelt by the lattice and ran a thumb along the vine's old scars, the marks where his mother's hands had coaxed it back from the brink. The vine answered with a small green insistence. It seemed to him then that the plants were not only living things but old, faithful witnesses that filed memory in living tissue. He thought about who might have sent the scrap and why the kitten had been chosen as courier. Was it a child's prank? A neighbor's jest? Or the notion that pulled at him like a thread had Miriam left a breadcrumb? The idea seemed almost too sentimental to entertain, and yet the garden and the scrap conspired to make sentiment feel like a logic. He could not know if the vine symbol meant that Miriam had been thinking of an old promise ode, or if it meant something more ordinary, a clue to a place, a code for a long-hidden chest. Whatever the plain content, the effect was the same. The ordered surface of his life had been lifted a little, and under it lay an itch that would not be ignored. Eli resolved to follow the smallest, most reasonable paths. He would visit the neighbors who knew Miriam. He would ask questions he had been avoiding. He would tidy the attic and see if the scrap matched any handwriting in their shared history. Habit and grief can sometimes conspire to keep a man still. Curiosity and a delivered thing have a way of setting him in motion. The kitten watched, composed as always, as if it had performed its task and now waited for the consequences to unfold. The inciting incident arrived not with a shout, but with a single, decisive bell. Beneath the scrap's looped vine, written faintly and nearly erased by time, was an address. No number. Only the name of a lane he had not thought of in many years and the word Larkspur. The word was like a small door opening in the belly of the present. Larkspur Lane had belonged to the town's older map, the sort of place where one's past could be found folded into hedgerows and the low roofs of houses that remembered one's name. It was the lane where Miriam had once taught Sunday school, and where, on a long-ago afternoon, she had found a stray book of pressed flowers. That single word did what a hinge does. It allowed the door of his day to swing toward something he had not planned to open. The scrap had been placed in his hand like an invitation or a summons. He felt the old ledger of his life tremble as if someone had turned a page he thought finished. The kitten brushed against his knee and looked up, its expression a small formal insistence. Outside, the vine by the lattice leaned as if to peer toward the lane the scrap suggested. Eli set the scrap beside the kettle as if leaving a map on a table. He made tea with hands that moved on old habits while the mind began to assemble roots. There were practicalities to consider. What kind of message is left in a lane without a number? Who wrote it? Why send an animal and not a person? The questions did not have to be answered in order. What mattered most was that a fissure had opened in the ordinary wall of his days, and through it came the possibility of change. He sat for a long while at the table, the kitten curled at his feet like a small warm parcel. The house around him was the same as it had been that morning in its fundamental details. The radio on the shelf, the clock that counted. Yet everything felt slightly rearranged. Even the light, which had once fallen across the table in the same narrow shaft each day, now pooled differently. It seemed to consider the scrap with him. The vine symbol was no longer only a mark of domestic habit. It had become a key whose teeth were yet to be turned. Eli did not rise yet. He allowed himself to feel the peculiar stir that a living summons brings, being asked by life to act when one has become practiced in passivity. The kitten, which had started this small ministry, blinked at him with eyes that reflected the morning. Somewhere down Larkspur Lane there might be a message waiting. Somewhere in his past the tangled cords of promise might be nudged into a new configuration. The scrap had created a question he could not ignore without feeling smaller. He finished his tea and, with the kind of deliberate smallness that had sustained him through many solitary days, took the scrap and folded it into his jacket. He decided, go to Larkspur. He would see what the vine meant. He would, at least for a short while, step outside the measured orbit of his ordinary life and follow the thread thrown to him by a creature no larger than a gloved handful. If this gentle story touched your heart, subscribing keeps this quiet little corner alive. Eli went to Larkspur Lane with the kind of small reverence one affords to places that hold other people's stories. The lane turned from the main road like a secret changing its coat. It narrowed and leaned over with hedges and low-roofed houses that smelled of dust and time. The air there was different, thicker with memory, as if the lane itself had been starched and ironed by decades of footsteps. Upstairs curtains moved like the slow breathing of old people behind thin windows. Laundry hung with the slow dignity of things that have served a life and are resting now. The kitten rode on his shoulder for part of the way, a warm, quiet thing that made him aware of his breath and the rhythm of a small heart. It walked at his heels when the path was rough, but whenever the road straightened it would leap to a fence post or a low wall and sit like a tiny black semaphore, tail curled, watching him with a trust that was not passive. Its presence kept him honest. He found himself saying the names of small things aloud, as if speech might coax a map out of the place. Rosemary, Mrs. Penley's gate. The old elm. Larkspur Lane answered with the rustle of leaves and the distant lilt of a radio. The lane had been kind once to people who liked to be found. There was a bench painted blue and chipped to the bone where young lovers had sat and carved initials into the wood, and in whose grooves rain still gathered like discreet tears. There were a pair of wrought iron brackets that had once held lanterns, and an ivy that had grown into the mortar of a porch like a soft, patient hand. Eli had not been down this lane in years. It was the sort of place that preserves its reasons for existence without asking much of anyone. To walk it was to step into a folded history that still preferred the old rhythms. When he reached the house named on the scrap, a narrow, moss-roofed cottage whose garden was a tapestry of scraggly marigolds and a prim old rose, he paused. Its gate hung on a hinge that sang when he pushed it, and the smell that rose to meet him was a mix of damp earth and dried lavender, which filled his chest with an ache that was equal parts comfort and regret. A woman in a shawl sat on the stoop, shelling peas into a bowl. She looked up at him as if his face were a story she had been trying to remember. "Can I help you?" she asked, not unkindly, with the quiet authority of someone who had lived long enough to know what strangers meant in a lane. Eli showed her the scrap. The vine symbol lay in his palm like an omen. The woman's fingers paused in their work. "The vine," she said, and her voice carried the lilt that makes a question sound like a memory. "You're not the first to bring that mark here this month. Has anyone else?" Eli began and then stopped. The sentence stalled because he did not know what to ask. "Who? Why, how?" The woman smiled, but it was small, careful. "You should speak to Mr. Harrow at the post," she said. "He keeps the notes for the lane. Or Corbin. Corbin owns the old mill now. But you look like you knew whoever left this." He did know, or at least he knew the name he could not speak aloud without feeling it in his palm. Miriam's hand, though he had not seen it for a year, had left trails he could follow. The way she preferred her tea, the way she tied her scarves, the arc of laughter that had once made the house softer. The vine, the tiny looped blossom, was part of a family language that had been stitched into the margins of his life. For someone to put that mark into the world like a breadcrumb meant either that they trusted him with the map, or that they wanted him to read something no one else should. He walked the lane asking questions as if questions could be gentle tools. They were not always. Sometimes they were stones thrown into ponds and the ripples reached farther than anticipated. Mr. Harrow, who ran the post and kept a ledger the size of a small Bible, looked at the scrap with a frown and tapped it on the table. "Someone's been leaving these about," he said. Old Mrs. Jenks found one tucked under her doormat. "There was one in the library book returns. You'd think they're making a scavenger hunt of grief. Do you know who?" Eli asked, forcing his voice to the curious tone of a man who went out to read the weather. Mr. Harrow pulled a face like someone about to offer a confession that must be wrapped. "There's talk," he said. "A woman called Miriam Jenks used to live around here. Quiet as a church mouse, full of secrets and kindness. She'd press flowers for the children at Sunday school. Then some years back they say she went away. Strange that she's come back if she's come back." Eli felt the color leave his face a little. The word come carries with it multiple maps: return, arrival, being. If Miriam had come back, it meant a rearrangement of terms he had learned to live by. He tried to steady his voice. Do you know where she lived? In the cottage you're standing at before she moved, Mr. Harrow said. Left it to a niece, then the niece moved and the house fell to silence for a while. Corbin had his eyes on it. Thought to make it a tea room. Folks here don't care for that idea. Some things don't need fixing. But if someone's left a vine sign around, maybe someone thinks there's something still here. Corbin. The name carried a certain kind of wind, businesslike, thin as a blade. Eli had not expected an antagonist to appear so early. But the world has ways of introducing edges. That night, Corbin had stood in the news many months ago as the man who cleaned up old properties by convincing the town that the present needed a brighter face. He had a way with plans that made old things feel like obstacles. If any secret the scrap pointed to lay inside a property deemed ripe for development, the urgency to find it grew. Where can I find Corbin? Eli asked. Office by the old mill, Mr. Harrow said. 2 doors down from the chandler. Not a pleasant man to meet at an awkward hour. Eli thought for a moment, aware of the kitten leaning into his leg, as if it too felt the direction of things. He could ask gently, he thought, or he could be firm. He could follow the soft routes people offer when they wish to be kind, or he could cut the cord and go straight to the place that had, in rumor, designs on memory. For Miriam's sake, if for no other, he chose the latter. There is a certain gravity that comes when one decides a thing must be done rather than merely endured. It rearranges the weight of concern into an action. Corbin's office smelled of old tobacco and new plans. Papers were stacked like small hills, and a map of the lane was spread across the desk, pins stuck into parcels of land like little accusations. Corbin was a man who smiled as if he were used to persuading the wind to change its course. Mr. Jenks, he said, rising and extending a hand that felt like a handshake learned in a different century, firm but designed to conceal. I suppose you've heard about our plans for the lane. New shops, brighter lights, and teas to bring folks in. Progress. Eli placed the scrap between his palms and did not let the hand take it. Someone left this for me, he said. Do you know anything about it? Corbin looked at the scrap, at its looped vine, and something that might have been the echo of annoyance flickered in his expression. Ah, he said, that symbol is old. People leave old things around to make us feel guilty. If you've a mind, Mr. Jenks, I've got a committee meeting next week and I'd be glad to include you, if you have ideas. It was a polite dismissal. Corbin's plan was large enough to swallow a cottage and small enough to call it progress. Eli left with the feeling of having been measured and found private. He walked the lane in a small circle, finding both support and skepticism at each porch. People who remembered Miriam with a fondness that warmed him, and people who would rather not see the past entangled with the present. The kitten, for its part, seemed to accept that men carry secrets and that one is expected to act on them sometimes. It trailed at his heels, stopping occasionally to sniff a leaf or to chase a drifting feather, then returning as if to make sure he was still with it. Eli noticed that the animal had a habit of pausing at certain gardens and staring as if it recognized a pattern. Once it sat and tapped a paw at a low stone wall where a tiny sprig of the vine, similar to the one on the scrap, pulled itself through a crack in the mortar. The kitten's attention seemed directed by threads Eli could not see. As the problems accumulated, they were not solely of the pragmatic kind. The first complication was Corbin, the man who could erase gardens with a packet of papers. The second complication was the town's memory, which was both generous and leaky. It preserved some things and forgot others. The emotion crowding Eli's chest was a complication in itself. It made decision messy. He found his hands trembling when he spoke to people, and his mind often strayed to images of Miriam in a shawl, laughing softly while pinching a blossom for a jar. Grief, suppressed though it had been by habit, rose like a tide that knows the shape of cliffs. A surprise came in a most domestic manner. While asking after Miriam, Eli ran into a young woman named Tamsin who kept an allotment of pots and who held in her hands a faded envelope with the same vine mark. She had found it under a bench in the playground where her children played. It had a note for you, she said, eyes bright in a way that made him think of needles gathering thread. Eli's fingers closed around the envelope like a man grasping a lifeline. Inside was a single sentence scrawled in a handwriting he knew like the back of his palm. Meet me where the river sings. There was no signature. The paper had the faint breath of perfume in it, rose perhaps, so faint that it felt like a private thing he had no right to inhale. Where by the river? Tamsin asked, as if she wanted to be part of the answer. Eli could picture the river, its slow curves, the willows dragging fingers in the water like a lullaby. There had been a boathouse long abandoned, where in the old days people would row and leave sandwiches wrapped in waxed paper. A place where one could be alone and no one would think to look for you. The river was a plausible hiding place for things people wished to make private. It was also a good place for messages. For leaves and small boats carry declarations that people cannot otherwise speak. Turning point. If the vine had been a map and the scrap his ticket, then the river was the destination. The first place in a long time where he might find a thing made by Miriam herself. To go there was to decide in a single motion to step out of the careful orbit of his ordinary life and into a field where certainty thinned. It was a decision of no return. When one chooses to follow a route marked by absence, one invites all the uncertainties of the past to present themselves. Eli packed a small bag, and with the kitten tucked inside the collar of his jacket, set out. The path to the river wound beneath trees that had seen 100 seasons of leaves. The air smelled of damp wood and green things decaying into soil. He thought often in those moments of the quietness that precedes a change, that hush where the world holds its breath and waits to see if the next step will be towards disaster or revelation. With each footfall, his heart tightened with a mixture of hope and dread. At the boathouse, things held the shape of a long sleep. The wood was moss-soft, the paint peeled like old paper, and the lock on the door had been bent in such a way that it might once have been forced. Someone had visited recently, footprints pressed into the mud leading away along the marshes, and the air carried a hint of cigarette smoke that did not belong to the river. Items lay about as if someone had been interrupted. An empty cup, a pair of gloves, and strung across a beam, a length of ribbon with the vine symbol embroidered at its end. Eli's hands moved as if in two minds. The object had the intimacy of a curtain that had been pulled back. Someone else had been here, and that person had found ways to say what a person really means. He reached for the ribbon and felt the smallness of its weave. There was half-written text on a scrap of paper nailed to the wall, a list of names or places with small check marks beside some and question marks beside others. Beside the list, a pressed daisy lay as if someone had left a fingerprint of tenderness. He had found signs without finding the source. The boathouse, with its peeling paint and the river singing in the reeds, felt like the middle of a mystery and the edge of a promise. The kitten leapt onto an overturned oar and peered into the water as if it expected to see words written there. Eli's pulse had the frequency of a man both terrified and thrilled. The chain of small discoveries was becoming a net. Each clue tightened the possibility of an answer, and with it the risk that the answer might upend whatever home he had left behind. Midway through the rising tide of questions, Eli paused and looked down at the kitten, which sat like a little oracle. "Have you ever had an animal wait for you when you didn't ask them to?" He muttered aloud, half to the creature and half to himself because the question belonged to more than one person. He thought too loudly to be so private. "Do you believe cats know when we're at our lowest?" It was a foolish question to speak under reeds and sky, but the air received it and folded it back like a neighbor returning a courteous nod. The kitten blinked and nudged his palm with its head, as if it claimed not to know the meaning of human words but to understand their shape. A soft answer came from somewhere in him, that animals understand the bones of loneliness and sometimes carry the map of a person's need. The discoveries continued. In a hollow rotten with time, he found a small tin box sealed with rust. The scrap of paper on top bore once more the vine symbol, and inside the box a bundle of letters lay tied with ribbon. The handwriting on the topmost letter was unmistakably Miriam's, loops soft and sure. Eli's breath hitched in his throat. He unfolded one with fingers that felt clumsy, as if the act of touching the paper might break something fragile and make it fly away. The letters spoke of ordinary things: plans for winter, a complaint about a neighbor's dog, a recipe for apple tarts. But beneath the practicalities, like a thread sewn through the cloth, ran a quieter pattern. Mentions of a place called the Elm Room, a rendezvous at dusk, worries about a decision. One line in particular arrested him. "If I must leave, I will leave what I cannot say in the place where water keeps secrets." It was the sentence that caused the world to tilt. Miriam had written as if to arrange for a future she might not witness. The phrase, "water keeps secrets," was not only a lyric but a map leading him back to the river in which he now stood. She had left words to be found, and someone or something had placed them. The net had become a trap both rescuing and dangerous. Eli read until sunlight thinned and the air cooled with the sound of wings. He carried the letters back through the lane, the weight of them like something alive in his bag. He thought of Corbin and the way plans for tidy rows and bright shops could erase the quiet rooms where memory keeps its things. The letters were more than evidence. They were Miriam's voice arranged for him, perhaps deliberately, perhaps by someone who wished to be kind. They suggested a mindful act, the work of someone who had either loved him still or wanted to stir him into motion. There was one more surprise that evening. A note slipped into his mailbox by someone who had been watching. It read simply, "You'll find more at the well behind the mill." A friend, no signature. The town had become a knot of small hands nudging him along a path that made sense only to those who shared certain memories. The presence of companions in a mystery is both balm and hazard. It means you do not face the unknown alone, but it also means other wills and motives entangle in your route. The turning point arrived with the kind of clarity that shocks. While he read the letters by the light of a lamp, his son, unexpectedly as the moon rounded the window, came to the doorstep. He had not been seen much lately. His life had their own map, one of work and a new family, and the distance between father and son had been a quiet thing. The son's face was older, the edges more determined. He carried himself like a man who had learned to make decisions and not second-guess them. "You're reading her letters," he said with no preamble. It was not a question but an observation. The presence of the son rearranged the geometry of Eli's plan. He had thought his search might be a small personal pilgrimage, but the arrival meant others would be pulled in. The son's eyes flicked to the scrap that lay on the table. A hard line formed between his brows. "Don't do anything reckless," the son said, and his voice carried the undertone of someone who had not yet forgiven absence. Eli had no right to be surprised. There were rents in family fabric that only time and courage repair. His own story with his son had holes. The son's warning felt like a hand pulling at a coat. Precaution had become the law in the younger man's code. It was after the son left, and after the house settled into the low rhythm of night, that the final sharpness of this axe rising motion took place. Eli had been awake only a short while when he heard the sound of a car pulse down Larkspur Lane and stop as if it had found its position. Someone walked up the path toward his door. He opened it without thinking, and on the stoop stood a figure with a hat pulled low and a silhouette that might have belonged to a messenger from the past. The person offered no greeting but thrust into his hands a small envelope sealed with a smear of dirt and a single line of ink that matched Miriam's circle of vine. "You were not meant to be easily found," the figure said, voice like gravel mixed with sugar. "But you were meant to know, don't delay. The mill will take what it needs next week. If there is something you must keep, you must act before Monday." The voice was not his son's. It carried a certainty that had the taste of a command. Eli's ribs tightened. The world had coalesced into a center of urgency. Corbin's plans, the letters, the appearances around the lane. Each element had become a pressure making his options smaller and more urgent. He read the message inside the envelope only once, a name and a place and a time. It was enough to prod him into decision. He would go to the mill. He would speak to Corbin. He would demand that if anything were being erased, something of the life he and Miriam had lived be saved. There was no going back to the safety of an ordinary day. He slept a little that night in a way that felt like someone sitting near a fire that could flare up. When dawn came, the kitten tumbled into his lap with the same untroubled grace of an oracle who has delivered a message and will not be asked to explain it. Eli's hands shook as he packed his bag. The map of action unfurled in his mind like a paper boat set on a current. And then, at the threshold between home and the unknown, a sound reached him, a soft, low laugh, as familiar as the breath of a room you'd once warmed. It was not the son's voice, nor yet a neighbor, but someone who knew the cadence of Miriam's laughter and could shape it like a practiced instrument. The sound fell away as if it had been caught and released, and in its wake something colder slotted into place. A shadow moving across the lane, deliberate and too close. Eli turned, as if to chase the shape. He had a small certainty and a small fear that the path he had chosen was now no longer private. that whatever secret the vine had held would be brought into the light by more than his hands. He could not know whether the laughter was the beginning of the end or a trick to lure him forward. What he knew with the exactness of a man who has felt the ground shift beneath a house was that the river had revealed a part of the map, and that somebody else, someone with an interest in what lay hidden, had also decided to act. He moved toward the sound without planning why. The lane narrowed before him like the neck of an instrument. At the boathouse, a shadow stood in the doorway, tall, still, waiting. Eli's throat tightened. The silhouette took a step forward, and a voice said, clear and without preamble, "You shouldn't have come alone." It was not an accusation. It was a fact. He had come to seek a memory led by a kitten and a scrap of paper stitched with a vine. Now, at the margin of the river's lullaby, the search had met an obstacle and a presence that shifted the terms. He felt the weight of all his choices stack like the rings of a tree cut in half, round, revealing years, and impossible to move without great labor. The kitten arched its back and hissed softly, a sound that did not belong to its usual manner. Eli's breath fogged in the air. The figure in the doorway moved its head, and for one terrible, impossible beat he thought he saw the profile of Miriam. Then the shape blurred and rearranged into a stranger. "Who are you?" Eli asked, with the thin, careful courage of a man who had learned to speak when he was afraid. The figure's reply was a sentence that folded everything into a new question, and then stopped. "We have been watching the lane for what you call progress. Some things should not be discovered." Then the words that would hang like a hook at the end of this act's rising arc. "If you want what she hid, you will have to take it where we keep our things." The sentence landed like a door closing. It was an invitation and a threat. It made clear that this was no longer only about letters and a boathouse. It meant that the secret had value to other people, people with motives and means. Eli felt the current of the river beneath him as if it had turned cold. He realized with an intimacy that frightened him that the search he had begun with a scrap in the company of a kitten had become a passage into something that would ask of him more than he had prepared to give. He could have walked away then. He could have let the matter be contained in the letters and the garden, and returned to the slow rituals that had kept his heart in a manageable place. Instead, the small thing in his chest, curiosity and the aching for what had been, pulled him forward. He stepped from the bank toward the boathouse, the kitten at his heels, and into the dark that waited beyond the open door. The night inhaled. The reed song stopped. The river held its breath, and somewhere inside the boathouse, in the heart of shadow, someone moved to welcome him and to bar his entrance. The boathouse held its breath like a thing that has been asked a question it did not expect. The river's voice thinned to a whisper that could be heard between heartbeats. Eli stood in the doorway as if the threshold were a line drawn not in dust but in time. Beyond it, the darkness kept its own counsel. The shadow who had warned him was no longer simply a shape, but a presence that filled the room with a slow, polite menace. Corbin, perhaps the faceless agent of tidy plans, had not come alone. Behind the doorway, the mill's lamps painted strangers into sharp angles, men in the kind of coats that know exactly how to keep someone from remembering where they left courage. Eli felt the letters in his bag as if they were small, warm beasts. They had led him on a journey of knees and quiet nights to the place where memory sat like a small, watchful thing. Now memory meant a choice. He understood with a sudden, exquisite clarity what the river had meant as a guardian. Water keeps secrets by taking and keeping them until someone brave or foolish drags them back into light. Miriam had chosen the river deliberately. She had hidden her particular truth where the world would have to look for it. "Stand aside," the tall man in the doorway said. His voice was the kind you hear in rooms where deals are struck and then dusted off to look clean. He had a mouth that smiled enough to lie about it. "We don't want trouble, Mr. Jenks. Corbin just wants what's rightfully his. This lane needs sorting. It needs a plan that makes sense for everyone. Your, sentimental artifacts—" "They are not artifacts," Eli said. The words came out like iron drawn through wool. They had no finesse, only the force of a man willing to name what he felt. "They are records. They are promises, promises." The word hung between them like a bell. It was a small word with a big shadow. For Miriam, it had meant soil and sapling, a stitched-together binding of human intention to the earth. For Corbin, it meant property that could be surveyed and sold. In the boathouse, two languages met. one of law and ledgers and tidy lines on a map, the other of tenderness and obligations left folded in paper and under ribbons. They were not the same grammar. "We have a right to redevelop," Corbin's voice cut in from the back. He had the knack of a man who frames his hunger as service. "There's no deed here that keeps anything for the town forever. Furnish the legal binding and I'll be the first to stop. Until then," he shrugged with an innocently cruel ease. Eli thought of the way Miriam had once told him that people hold small things like promises the way children hold creatures, with awe and the fear of losing. If she had hidden a deed, it would have been in plain sight by a method that trusted memory and misdirection rather than legal malarkey. She had never been a woman of lawyers. She was one of nodding and grafting in morning light. The letters Eli had found were proof of her intention, but perhaps not of enforceable property. If there were a deed, it would be hidden in the way the river keeps secrets, folded into wood, pressed into a tin, wrapped in soil. Someone who loved a place like Miriam would bury the heart of it where water could sing over it, and the reeds would stand witness. "Search him," Corbin ordered. Two men moved like small professional tides and took hold of Eli's shoulders as if he were a coat on a peg. The kitten, a thin, grave thing, hissed and darted between boots like a skittering punctuation mark. The men's hands were careful but not kind. Eli felt the weight of his life being inspected by people who measured value by the cheapness of a handshake. One of the men found the tin box, rusted at the edges but bound in a kindness of twine. He held it up like evidence to be assessed. Corbin advanced, and there was for a second a human flicker across his clean features. Curiosity, then compulsion. He brushed aside the twine with a thumb made used to ripping things open. "No need for theater," Corbin said, and cracked the lid. Eli watched as the light fell into the tin and revealed not a deed written on legal parchment, but a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. The edges of the cloth were stained with river mud and time. Within that was a packet of letters, Miriam's slanted script, a photograph, a sprig of pressed lily of the valley, and beneath them, folded small as a seed, a thin paper that smelled faintly of lavender and ink. When Corbin unfolded it, the room seemed to lean in. It was not a deed, not in the legal sense. It was an act, a short handwritten covenant that Miriam had addressed to the community of the lane and signed with the small authority of one who had known what she had to give. It read in the kind of clarity that does not need a lawyer's stamp. "I give this patch of garden and all the things that grow in it to the people who live on Larkspur Lane. Tend it, and when I am not here, let others know its name." At the bottom, in the looping hand Eli had loved, was a single word, "Witnessed," and then a name. Someone old and respected in the town who had since passed. The paper bore a tear where someone in haste or tenderness had folded it often. For an instant the room breathed as if it had been relieved. Legal papers in the courts of the world wear stamps and signatures. The human courts sometimes accept a different kind of seal, a witness remembered, a community that has held promise for years. Corbin's smile thinned and hardened. He turned the paper between fingers that had not learned how to read moral authority. "Sentimental nonsense," he said, but his voice had lost some of its smoothness. He read the name, and behind the eyes a map of doubt moved like cloud. "You can't just," Eli began. The words were a prayer and a plea and a dagger of hope. If the covenant were accepted by the town, if people remembered the witness and the giving, then Corbin's plans would need to contend with something older than his glossy brochures. But there was another paper beneath the covenant. When Corbin lifted the papers, a narrower envelope slipped out and fluttered like a trapped moth. On the front, in a hand Eli recognized with a stab of both joy and fear, was written his name. The room packed tighter than before. Corbin's hand hesitated at the envelope. He had the habit of men who think a pause is a strategy. "You should not have come alone," the shadow had said. For a moment the shadow's voice became a limitation in Eli's chest. He felt conspicuously unarmed. He would have given up the bundle if it meant peace, if memory could be converted into inaction, and that would somehow honor Miriam. But the kitten, with a noble quiet that does not need to be explained, fixed him with an animal's unwavering sense. It nudged his ankle the way people nudge those they love to remind them of courage. "Open it," Corbin said, with an impatience that was an invitation and a threat. Someone in the room clicked a lighter. The flame painted every beard and wrinkle with a conspiratorial gold. The documentary smell of tobacco and river mold mixed in the air like two countries meeting on a border. Eli's hands moved of their own accord. He took the envelope from Corbin's fingers. They were too warm and too human. The flap was unsealed and a single sheet fell out like a confession. Eli read the first line and felt the floor drop away from under the surface of his life. Miriam's handwriting, those familiar curls, the private punctuation, had shaped words meant for him. It was a note, brief and trembling with the tenderness of a woman who had learned stitches of secrecy. She had written of a plan both practical and impossible, a legal maneuver, a friend with a name now faded that would witness her gift, and instructions that required a chosen person to carry out an act at the heart of the boathouse. She had written that if she could not be the living witness for the covenant, she would bury its key in a place no surveyor would think to look, a small iron key wrapped in oilcloth and then in a seed pouch, the sort made for pilgrims who wished to leave stories in the earth. She had written that her only hope was someone who remembered the vine in particular, who could follow domestic language and the small gestures of a life that loved Elaine. If you read this, the note said finally, it means I trusted that a life of tending counts for something. Plant the seed where the lane is most lonely and tell them it is for promises. The men in the room looked at him as if he had been a character in an unfolding fable, rather than a man with a heart. Corbin's jaw tightened as if to decide whether to laugh or never speak again. He fancied himself a man who could buy silence, craft agreement, and rebrand grief as development. The letters, the covenant, the note, they were all awkward resistances to the type of order he desired. He could have paid the town's legal costs and bought their memories if he wished. But memory is a thing that does not come with price tags. You see, Corbin said at last with the careful cruelty of a man who will make a point of being right. This is lovely, really, but it will not stop progress. You have sentiment, Mr. Jenks. We have land registry and permits. He smiled as if that made everything clean. At those words, the room realized that there was one thing missing. The tin had held the covenant and letters and the photograph showed Miriam younger, hands dimpling with the same patience that had guided her hands in the garden. But the key, Miriam's seed pouch, the small iron thing she had written about, was not there. Eli's breath shortened in a way that made the letters sharp in his palm. Someone had taken it before the tin had been found. Where is it? He asked, not as a demand but as a breaking. The question was a stone tossed and the ripples caught every eye. Corbin's smile was a shadow of courtesy. If someone wanted such an object, Mr. Jenks, they would have needed to be cleverer than you at hiding it. He folded the covenant and the note with the air of a man stowing an inconvenience. We're done here. The men moved like the tide. The kitten yowled and slipped between boots, a small white thread in a dark hem. Eli felt fury and despair, and something that smelled like old courage take shape in his chest. The world that Miriam had sewn together with small stitches was at risk of being cut away by a swaggering hand. He thought of the vine's curled blossom, the symbol that had called him from the safety of habit into this knot of action. A promise had landed at his feet. Now he had to decide whether he would let it slide into the river. Wait! A voice split from behind the lamp gleam. It was the son who had arrived unannounced and now stood in the doorway like a man who had been given a sudden, sharp instruction. His face was pale with the kind of indignation only a child raised by a father could muster, and yet it carried a broader, more blunt authority. Someone who had woken to the fact that the world would not repair itself without hands. You will not take what isn't yours. We have witnesses. We have people who know where the truth lies. Corbin's men hesitated. It was a tiny fissure. Even a millstone can be nudged if the right point of pressure is found. The sun's presence altered the dynamic the way a hinge finds a new position when oil is applied. He stepped forward and placed a hand on his father's shoulder. An awkward touch, two dry branches trying to make a living thing meet. Do what's right, he said to Eli in a voice that was half plea, half command for the man he sometimes knew as a child. Eli felt something inside him loosen. The son had become an ally, but also a mirror. For years they had circled each other like two trees grown apart by a fence. Now they were leaning toward the same patch of light. He felt the possibility that their shared grief could be made into something useful. Corbin's face hardened. You're sentimental because you're not considering the practicalities, he said. For a moment he was a man who believed in the arithmetic of profit. Give us the covenant and leave the rest. He turned to the men and nodded, as if they were only the next instruments in a Well-programmed design. It was then that the decisive moment arrived, an instant where the world narrowed, until only the necessary choice could be made. Eli could let the Covenant go and salvage the quiet of his old life, letting Corbin's plan take the lane and the rosebeds and the memory of Miriam like a sheaf cut from the field. Or he could act in the small, foolish way human beings sometimes do. Risk humiliation, danger, perhaps even loss of safety to make sure a promise left by someone you loved was kept. He moved with the slowness of someone who knows the value of a single motion. He picked up the photograph from the tin. It was Miriam with a small girl's hand in hers, someone who might have been a neighbor, someone who might have witnessed. He held it to Corbin's face as if to accuse him with the thing he least could see. "You cannot sense the weight of what this is," he said, voice rasping with the force of a man who suddenly knew how to speak. "You measure the world in parcels. This," he tapped the photograph against the planks of the boathouse, "is how people remember their names. It deserves a chance." A laugh came from somewhere low and not unkind. Corbin's smiles never reached his eyes. "You are an honest fool," he said. "But foolishness does not stop a planning permission. Give it up." Eli did not give it up. He thrust the stack of papers and the Covenant into his coat and turned, moving toward the doorway as if he would exit with the talismans of a life tucked into his chest like a heart. A man stepped forward, but the sun moved faster. Then the shadow figure, one of Corbin's men, saw an opportunity and lunged for Eli's arm. A scuffle followed in which a lantern tipped and the light made flames that painted faces in an urgent, hungry gold. The kitten leapt onto the oar and skittered. Men shouted. The river, a patient witness, slapped against its moorings like a hand to the side of a boat. In the tumble, a thing happened small and perfect and terrible. The thin paper with Miriam's instructions fluttered free from Eli's grip and fell into the river with the quiet of a small boat unmoored. It turned once in a soft, decisive circle, carried by a current that took anything unanchored and spun it toward the middle of the channel. The river accepted the paper with the polite indifference of water to human dramas. For a second, Eli felt that the world had moved to a place from which one could not step back. The key was gone. The physical proof was slipping away, and in its place a new, harsher fact arrived like a tide. Someone cursed. Corbin barked orders and men moved like a rusted machine. The son swore and launched himself after the paper, footfalls loud on the mud. Eli, because the world has a strange appetite for the brave and the foolish, dove after the thing he could not bear to lose. The cold hit him like a hand. The river took him in with a blunt embrace and then spat him toward the far bank. The water was honest and hungry, and for a moment the only sound was the pumping of his own lungs. Above him the lantern light wavered. Hands reached down. The son helped him up, and for a wild, clear second father and son were two beings in an earnest, clumsy ballet, bound by something older than quarrels. They staggered to the river's edge with Corbin's men around them like circling birds. The kitten sat on the bank, a small, incredulous witness, its tail flicking like a metronome. They thought themselves safe when they pulled themselves ashore, dripping mud that stitched itself to their shoes and their resolve. But when Eli pushed at his coat where the letters had been, his fingers closed on cloth and not on paper. He felt instead the small, cool hardness of metal against his chest where a pocket sat like a secret room. His hand fumbled in and found metal, small iron and corroded at the edges. The key. Warm with the river's breath, it had not been claimed by the current after all. Somehow, as if by miracle or a kindness of angles, it had folded into his coat and not into the water. He held it like a newly found promise. His heart leapt at the sight, and for a heartbeat the world was simple. Some things are returned to us if we will only reach. But the world does not allow long and easy breaths to those who have begun to pull loose the threads of its tapestry. Corbin, failing now at the rhetoric of gentleness, moved with the sudden certainty of a man who decides to take rather than negotiate. "You think this changes anything?" Corbin said, the words like an unsheathed blade. He had a hand at his coat. The men behind him hemmed circle. "Legal counsel, permits, your good intentions don't stop the wheel." Eli held the key against his palm. The iron was rough like a seed shell. He could choose 1,000 quiet ways to surrender. Hand over the key. Let a lawyer in a suit take up his cause where he could not. Let the town vote at a meeting in which memory is weighed against glossy renderings. But the river had shown him that some proofs are not proof until someone makes them so. The covenant was a letter of will. The key was a physical insistence. Either could be converted into action by the only thing that lends moral force to paper, people's insistence. And so he moved, not with the fury of someone consumed by wrath, but with the gentleman's stubbornness that had been his quiet engine for years. He planted his feet in the mud and drew from his pocket the tin, opened it to show the covenant, and then, decisively, held the key up between thumb and index like a small judge. "If you value the lane more than your plans, step back," he said, his voice steady as the oar that had been mended many times in a go. "If you do not, then you make clear to everyone what you value." Corbin's eyes glinted. It was a moment of negotiation without lawyers, pure providence and naked will. He had the means to call a court, to frighten away old neighbors with the promise of jobs and light. He chose instead to test the soft will of a community. "You think the town will rally for poetry over profit?" He sneered. Then, as if the fable required its chorus, the lane itself answered. From porches and hedges there came movement. Mrs. Penley with a broom, Mr. Harrow with his ledger under his arm, Tamsin with her children at her heels, and others whose faces Eli recognized like the familiar stitches on an old quilt. They had watched the play from the fringes, and now their small feet made a sound that resembled resolve. Voices rose, not in rage, but in the murmur of people who had been given an invitation to remember their own names. "That garden is ours," someone called. Miriam promised it. The words spread like a small hymn. The crowd thickened, and Corbin's men had to rethink the arithmetic of manpower. When citizens gather, bargains must be made in a different currency. Corbin's front tightened. His plans had not accounted for a lane that could still be roused. He glanced at a man with a radio, and then at a truck idling not far away. In his eyes there was the calculation of profit, and the math told him this might not be the fight to take on in mud and with a crowd. He had other ways, lawyers' permits, the economy of small interest and long memory. But tonight, under the river's breath and the lane's willing chorus, he had a choice: back down now and live to plan again, or press forward and risk becoming the force the lane would remember with a name like villain. Corbin's jaw worked for a second like a machine winding. Then, in the way of men who think themselves clever, he chose a different weapon, a document in his hand thick with official stamps, to be presented at the first light of day, a planning permission that, if he kept the town at bay until morning, would make the lane's current protest a literary novelty rather than a legal obstacle. "Tonight is nothing," he said, and turned to leave, ordering his men in a tone that was equal parts command and ruse. "We will pursue this in court. You will have your hearing, Mr. Jenks. Prepare to be disappointed." As his truck rumbled away and the men melted into the dark like a tide withdrawing, the lane reached in and touched Eli with its small human warmth. Neighbors offered cloths and cups of tea. Mr. Harrow clucked like a bird and took the covenant into his hands to copy it. Tamsin's children found the kitten and gave it a name, promise, they declared, and then argued over who would keep it if the world stayed kind. Eli's chest was a mix of exhausted gladness and something sharper. He had not won in the legal sense. Corbin's vehicle had been a delaying tactic, his permits a sword to be sharpened in daylight. Yet they had reclaimed a story for at least one night. The key sat in Eli's hand like a small warming star. He had held it and chosen to show it. The town had gathered and remembered. But the river, capricious and secretive, had taken from them something else, or so he had thought. And in the midst of this, amid the cups and the warm condolences, a different sound reached them, the distant, uncanny drop of someone hammering at metal. They turned as one. Down Larkspur Lane, where the streetlight threw a narrow cone of silver, a van had parked. Its back doors were flung open, and men with the kind of badges that gleam without the courtesy of truth were moving toward the mill with purposeful, legal gait. Corbin had not left the field. He had merely shifted his instruments. The hammering sounded again, faster, harder, like a clock whose ticks are disgruntled. It came from the place where the mill keeps its records, where in the morning the town would find papers stamped and stamped again with authority. Eli felt a strange, small emptiness even while his heart rose. He clutched the key. The night had given them something and had removed its certainty. The covenant sat with Mr. Harrow in trembling hands. The son stood at Eli's side, an awkward arm around his father as if to hold him steady between the ache of the past and the practice of the present. The kitten, newly christened, circled their trousers like a small, loyal comet, and then, as if the story were not yet finished with its appetite for suspense, A new silhouette detached itself from the milling figures by the mill. It was a woman moving with the deliberate step of someone who has chosen to return to a place that once bore her fingerprints. She came not with haste, but with the calm of someone who knows the exact length of a knot. For a breath, the lane held a sharper hush. Some people do not return to places lightly. They arrive very much like paradoxes. A familiar stranger with old maps. She paused at the boathouse threshold and looked at Eli. The river, as if reminded of its old debts, made a soft, low sound as if to make room for her. Her coat was the sort Miriam might have chosen, pressed at the shoulders as if even in absence she had kept her small courtesies. For the length of a breath, Eli felt his life condense into the single point of seeing her face, which was older, but carried the same small, urgent light as before. Miriam? The question was a sound caught between a hope and a dare. It seemed foolish to invoke such a name. Yet for Eli it was the single necessary motion. She did not answer at once. She walked forward slowly, and the lane itself seemed to bend toward her like the weather turning politely to meet a guest. Behind her, a small figure, older perhaps, but with the same neat bend of a shoulder, followed. The two women moved as if they belonged to a pattern that had been interrupted, and was now resuming its embroidery. In the hush, even Corbin's men slackened their forward motion. Miriam stopped within reach of the lamplight and looked at the tin in Eli's hand, and then at the gathered people. Her mouth moved as if testing words, then she smiled, small and full of the private sun she had always carried. "I should have done this sooner," she said, voice like the rustle of a page turned gently. "I thought I could keep it hidden until all was safe. But the earth is greedy for promises. It gives them back when it chooses. There is a peculiar kind of moment in which the world seems to pause on a hinge." The crowd drew in a collective breath, and for a second time the night felt like the inside of a held hand. Miriam had returned with a presence that was at once explanation and question. Corbin's truck idled like a challenge in the lane's mouth. The men by the mill moved again, now with the solemnity of those who, encountering the old and stubborn face of memory, wonder whether to proceed. Eli's hands shook as he extended the tin to Miriam. In the lamplight, the metal caught and twinned their faces. She took it with careful fingers and opened it. The covenant and the letters sat inside like a small archive of love. Then, and the air in the boathouse changed as if struck by a chord, she reached behind her coat and drew out a small wrapped object. It was, to the astonishment of all, a packet of seeds, and beneath them a tiny metal tag. Miriam's seed pouch and the little iron key he had feared gone forever. "How?" Eli began. The question dissolved in the face of proof. Miriam's eyes found his, and for a moment they moved across decades like birds returning on time. "I could not trust the paperwork alone," she said simply. "Promises must be planted where they can grow a witness. I took precautions. But when I could not return, I asked friends. People who knew how to hide things where water takes things and sometimes returns them to people who remember how to look." She smiled at the kitten, who had been christened in the heat of the night. "I also did something else. I left a map in small places, scraps, signs, and a tiny emissary who knew the way of my hands. This was the moment the story paid back the seeds it had sown. The kitten's arrival, the scrap with the vine, the ribbon at the boathouse, the notes in the tin. They had been arranged by someone who trusted domestic logic, the way promises and plantings speak the language of tending. Miriam's plan had been not only to protect the lane, but to lead back the man whose life had been quietly ordered by routine and grief. She had wanted him to act not because laws required it, but because love and memory had given him reason. Then Corbin moved, not with malice so much as the economy of men used to converting events into transactions. "We'll see about the legality of these. Gifts of land are a tricky matter without formal witnesses and deeds recorded with the council," he said, producing from a folder a stack of papers with the first light of cunning. He smiled in a way that suggested he intended to take the corridor of courts by day and grind the lane into policy. Miriam's face, however, had not been shaped by fear. She stepped closer, and with the simple authority of someone who has lived with knots and learned how to untie them, she set the small iron tag, a marker proof enough in the language of living neighbors, into the hands of Mr. Harrow. The ledger keeper's eyes widened until his face was a new map. He ran a finger across entries, and in a voice that carried the sound of someone calling a town together declared, "We will witness. The lane knows its own. Around them, life reasserted itself not in the thin voice of law but in the thicker, communal one of people who watch over each other. The mill's men hesitated, their badges glinting like uncertain stars. Corbin's truck idled like a machine that had not yet decided whether to be a destroyer or a small, embarrassed neighbor. The van near the mill revved and then stalled. The hammering stopped. Eli felt a sudden, humble triumph. The world had shifted not because law was waved like a flag, but because memory was offered as an armature upon which people could lean. But triumphs in human stories rarely come without cost. Corbin's last move was a letter delivered with legal teeth, an order that would test the community's resolve at the court of the day. He would not give up because men of his sort do not give up. They pivot. He left with the professional restraint of a man who plans long as the first rays of morning began to stitch themselves into the sky, and neighbors started to talk of meetings and witnesses, and the planting of seeds as proof. The night's drama folded into the soft domesticity of hot tea and bandaged palms. Talismans changed hands, promises were to be witnessed in the morning at the council, and Miriam stood at the boathouse like a woman who had performed a miracle by being patient enough to wait until people remembered how to be neighbors. Eli felt, in his chest, a slow unhooking of the tightness that had lived there for a year. The key was warm in his hand. The covenant would be copied and witnessed. The lane had chosen its side. He looked at his son, who now seemed less like a warning and more like an arm to hold on to. He felt gratitude for a kitten that had delivered a scrap as if the small animal were an emissary from fate. The town had roused itself, perhaps small and slow but real, and yet as the light changed, tender, decidable, yawning into day, another sound reached them. A vehicle rolled at the end of Larkspur Lane. Official, new, and too eager. Men with papers and the sort of flapping authority that believes in stamped power were stepping from it, with a speed that made Angel seem unhurried by comparison. Their badges shone. Their voices rehearsed the language of injunctions and orders. Corbin, who had retreated for the night, had not been idle. He had prepared the machinery of the law to blunt the memory the lane was gathering. The townsfolk turned toward the sound like people who hear a tide change. Miriam's face, which had been radiant with the success of a small triumph, now folded into something steadier. She grasped Eli's hand, her fingers steady as the roots of the vine she had loved. For a second, she looked at him like someone who had entrusted an old world to a new generation. "It will not end tonight," she said softly, with the kind of knowledge that comes from planting trees that will outlive their planters. "But names have weight. People will remember." Eli squeezed her hand back with a force born of relief and of the recognition that when a promise is planted in so many hands, it grows in a way that no single planter can cut through. He looked at the lane, at the faces in the lamplight, and felt a tide of affection and something close to awe. Miriam had returned not to fix a ledger, but to remind a town that promises are not only legal instruments but living things. They were not yet safe. The men from the van were moving toward them with papers in hand and a professional calm. The battle would come in courthouses and in committees and in the slow channels of public will. Corbin would not surrender the field without pleading his case. The key in Eli's pocket warmed his palm like a small insistence that the world might yet be moved by human care. And as the new men stepped forward, as morning widened and the lane braced itself for argument, and for the long, tender work of people insisting on a memory's worth, a hush that was not emptiness but a space waiting for decision fell over them. In that hush, as if to speak into the ear of the moment, the night asked its final, soft question, one that invited each heart there to answer in the way it knew best. Would you stay if you were in their place? The morning came like a careful witness, pale and certain, and with it the business of unpicking what the night had nodded. Larkspur Lane woke to the sound of talk that did not belong to idle gossip, but to the deliberate commerce of people who know their own names. Men arrived with clipboards and badges as if the town had summoned a tribunal. Women with aprons and scarves came bearing more practical evidence, photographs, ledgers, the little iron tag Miriam had entrusted to Mr. Harrow. Eli felt the weight of the night's work as a pleasant ache, like a hand that has been given work to do and remembers it with gratitude. The kitten, Promise now christened by enthusiastic children, slept in the crook of his coat like a small, patient sentinel. Corbin's men had not disappeared. They had only traded the hurry of the night for the clipped language of morning. He had the economy of a man who plans in stages, threats at night, Papers at dawn, a strategy that turned civic inertia into a smooth highway. He arrived in a well-pressed suit with a briefcase like a small dark animal. If one did not know better, one could mistake him for the town's future in one neat package. Investments, lights, tidy brochures. He stepped onto the lane with the polished gait of someone who had decided to make force respectable, but the lane itself had collected witnesses overnight. Neighbors who had once spoken only of weather now spoke of presence. The children who had played under the elm were tethered to elders who remembered Miriam's hands and the way she had thumbed the petals of roses into tidy bundles. Mr. Harrow came with the ledger and with the slow, authoritative voice of an archivist who knows where the town keeps its debts of heart. He opened his book and placed it upon a crate as if erecting a small altar to memory. In the ledger, in ink that had grown faint with the patience of years, was a line where Miriam's own hand had been recorded once as witness to an event. A small signature, the kind people leave to say, "I was here. I will remember." This modest paper trail had the quiet force of truth. Where lawyers bring forms, communities bring witnesses. They came forward one by one, and their testimonies were not legalese but the kind of sound that an entire lane produces when it remembers. Mrs. Penley swore to the kindness of Miriam's gifts. The baker, who had been given a jar of rosemary cut from the vine the woman tended, stood and said such things do not happen without intention. Even the kids, bright with the curiosity of small citizens, declared that the kitten, Promise, had led them to an envelope under the bench and to the ribbon at the boathouse. These were small facts, and yet when gathered together like stones they made an edifice of recollection. Corbin, for all his polished manners and his piles of paper, found the terrain unfamiliar. There are professions whose instruments are ledgers and stamps. There are other professions whose instruments are the memory of 1,000 small acts. When the lane speaks, the voices fold into one another like hands clasped in a ring. The men with badges could cite regulations. The men who had known Miriam could cite a life. Corbin tried to fold the ledger into his argument, to show permits he'd prepared and endorsements he claimed would come, but the presence of so many witnesses made the task unwieldy. Papers pile, but people remember. Eli watched the exchange as if it were a kind of sermon. He had once believed that the world would move upon the weight of single decisive papers. Miriam had taught him otherwise, that the world moves when people hold to something together. She had taught it with a vine and with seeds and the idea that tending is as much a legal instrument as ink. Standing beside the crate with Mr. Harrow's book spread open like an old map, he felt himself changing. The small man who had once measured his days by ritual now found his chest widening to contain the town's voices. Where grief had once hollowed him into a small, careful shape, the work of a promise spread his hands like someone who remembers how to plant. Miriam, standing not far from him, radiated a calm fashioned by necessity. Her return had not been theater so much as an act of stewardship. She spoke not with triumphant rhetoric, but with the patient language of one who had planted seeds for seasons beyond her. She answered questions with the kind of brevity that becomes a moral excavation. "I left what I could not carry where water keeps secrets," she said to the man who had asked if she might have arranged things to be found. "I trusted neighbors to be neighbors. The rest I left to those who would listen." When the councilman arrived, an official with a voice that wears shoes polished by committees, he came to measure the mood. He found the lane full of witness and the chest of the community swung open. The law, which in many places is the final arbiter, is sometimes obliged to listen to the chorus of those it serves. The councilman read the covenant aloud, his voice a flat reed over the lane's gathered breath. The words seemed small and yet enormous in that moment. They were not sculpted by lawyers, but sown by a neighbor who had known how to bind promises into soil. Legal counsel, for Corbin argued that a deed must be registered and that ceremonies of giving without formal registry do not always bind in the sterile arithmetic of law. There is a mercy to law and a hardness to it, and in the morning the two sat in awkward tension. Yet the town, by which, I mean the gathered people who have known one another's births and small deaths, was not merely a jury, but a living argument. Mr. Harrow petitioned the councilman to consider Mr. Jenks's evidence and Miriam's covenant in a broader spirit, that not all obligations are created by legal instruments, that rights of place often rise from the collective memory of who tended. He read old entries where neighbors had witnessed acts of giving in the same informal way over decades. He showed that the town's own customs had created precedent. The argument carried weight beyond the immediate legalities. 100 small actions, elders vouching, children carrying up old tins, neighbors' hands pressing the seed pouch into the official ledger for safekeeping, were being assembled like a living ritual. The garden itself was present as witness. The vine at the lattice had uncurled a new shoot. The rosemary gave off a small cleansing scent that the morning seemed to inhale as if to renew itself. Plants, which had been mere props in Eli's quiet days, served now as testament. Miriam's vine had become more than an emblem. It was a living sign that promises can be kept when the community chooses to tend them. In the midst of this slow assembly, Eli learned a small truth that would not have been granted to him in the dark of the boathouse. Courage, when given a body, is contagious. His son, who had arrived at the river with a hand ready to push his father into the water and who had come to the boathouse unsure and raw, found himself speaking in a voice steadier than he had expected. He told how as a young boy Miriam had wrapped his scraped knee in yellowed gauze and fed him a tart she had made, so that her hands had been part of his earliest stitches. The son's story was small and tender, and it broadened the argument not by artifice but by truth. Love had been both domestic and civic in its reach. The men from the van, legal agents and the sort who make their bread from paperwork and enforcements, moved with the mechanical comfort of their trade. They would take this fight to court if need be. A person with plans rarely gives up because a few folks with aprons make noise. Corbin's counsel, however, found that the lane's collective memory had made a different kind of docket. The eyes of neighbors, the thrumming of common life, and the fact that the covenant had a witness remembered in an elder's name. Corbin recalculated. He had the patience to pursue his case through processes. But the town had the teeth of communal will, which has a stubbornness that binds reality in ways courts sometimes cannot immediately override. There was a small, decisive moment when words met the public authority. The councilman, bemused perhaps by the pastoral originality of this claim, recommended a temporary injunction. It would pause any alterations to the lane until a proper hearing could be set, allowing the community to bring its witnesses and for the paperwork to be examined. It was a procedural parody, neither a defeat nor a victory, but it granted enough time for the lane to gather its strength. Corbin, who had relied on the slipperiness of legal works, saw in the injunction a delay that could be turned to his favor if he were clever. He left with the promise of a planned hearing and a smile that promised to be polite in court, and so the immediate threat was arrested, not resolved, but arrested. Arrest is not the same as victory, yet it is often the price of being given time to plant and water and make your case real. Against such a temporary reprieve, the lane celebrated with the modest joy of those who have stood against erasure, and prevailed, if only for a moment. They brewed tea and stood by gates and mapped out plans for the public hearing. The kitten, Promise, received a small nap on the knee of a child who insisted it was their duty to honor animals who deliver messages. For Eli, the falling action was not merely the legal reprieve but the untying of private knots. The letters found in the tin, the covenant witnessed by Mr. Harrow, and the seed pouch Miriam had kept close to her person returned to him those quiet treasures of meaning. Miriam explained in the modest voice of someone who had been away long and who had returned to right a small wrong, that she had gone because some things in her life required tending that could not be done in a single place. She had cared for a relative in a neighboring town who fell ill soon after she left. She had worked to save coins and to gather witnesses to ensure that the lane's gifts would not be steamrolled by developers who know only profit. Her leaving had been a stewardship disguised as absence. The small intimacies, the pressed flower, the ribbon's loop sewn into the boathouse beam were proofs of a woman who knew how to hide a heart where the world would find it tenderly. There was an answer to the question of why a kitten had been chosen as courier. It turned out that Miriam had befriended a young woman who kept animals and had a soft sense for how creatures travel, how they move through hedges and under gates where people might not. The kitten's small body and keen appetite for nooks made it the ideal bearer of tiny scraps in the kind of world where humans misplace meaning, but animals do not. The garden's plants, too, answered. The vine's new shoot had been coaxed by hands other than Eli's during his absence. Plants, which remember the care they receive long after people forget the names that tend them, had been tended in secret while Miriam arranged the covenant and the key. Each of these small discoveries stitched a larger cloth. The falling action was the place where consequences of choice made themselves known. Community rallied. the law would be contended with. The secret proved to be not merely a legal document, but a living thing that required tending. Eli found that his grief, once a hollow evening that made rooms feel heavy, could be transmuted into work that honored memory, where once he had kept tea warm for a ghost presence. Now he marshaled neighbors and letters and seed pouches as if they were tools of a trade. Stewardship. He also discovered, with a quiet, throbbing gratitude, that his son was not the man of cautions he had feared, but a person who could bear witness and arrange for justice. Their relationship, strained by the slow erosion of time and separate horizons, repaired itself in the modest acts of shared labor, copying the covenant, delivering notice to the council, sitting in the court, hearing that would come and translating neighborhood recollections into formal testimony. They learned to speak a language that was neither grief nor accusation but cooperative tending. Remember how she braided the rosemary? The son would ask a neighbor, and the neighbor would nod and produce a story that clerked the lane's memory into a living record. Payoffs from earlier plants arrived with a delightful logic. The vine by the lattice, the one Miriam's mother had tended and the one that had been drawn on the scrap, had given up a ribbon its roots had hidden in winter. That ribbon's loop, once found at the boathouse, functioned as both a literal clue and a symbolic seal. The vine's growth had been the literal witness Miriam had counted on. The seed pouch she had intended to bury had, in a twist of weather and perhaps providence, ended up in Eli's coat as he reached into the river. It had been wrapped in river mud and smelled of things that belonged to water. This small salvation, one might call it luck or kindness of angles, was the sort of remarkable end to which fables incline. It was a thing the lane would tell its children. How a key found its way back into a pocket when a man dove into river water to rescue paper that carried a pledge. As days passed and the feverish drama cooled into the steady rhythm of preparation for a hearing, the central conflict's edge grew duller. Corbin's legal team filed the documents they must. The town gathered witnesses who rehearsed their testimonies with the same care they had for recipes. Mr. Harrow made copies of every piece of paper and placed them in community hands. The councilman set a date. There would be arguments in court, the kind to be recorded in minutes and transcripts. There would be, if the heart of the populace held a legal acknowledgement that would preserve the lane's gifts. But even if the formal instruments failed in some future moment, the lane had already performed a victory. It had remembered. The narrow human transformations were clearer than any legal victory. Eli woke each morning with a readiness in him that had not been there for a year. He would walk the garden with promise at his feet and find that the small gestures he made, pruning a dead rose, tying a sapling, were perfected by the knowledge that someone else might notice and carry on. Miriam took her place among them, not as a figure who demanded accolades, but as a woman who returned to find the tendings of the life she loved continued by others. She worked alongside the neighbors, teaching a child how to graft a stem, showing an elderly neighbor where to press a petal for a seed, explaining with a soft authority the logic of a vine. And in perhaps the simplest payoff of all, the vine itself, old, patient, and now bearing a new shoot, stood as a living parable that promises may outlive absences when tended. It had been a motif from the beginning, a mark on a scrap, the emblem in a covenant, a ribbon in a boathouse. In the falling action, it matured into its own proof, an organism that recorded care and thus testified to it. It was what Miriam had known and what Eli had learned. The world binds itself when hands bend to it. The lane's final quirks were humane and small. Children painted a sign for the garden that read, in childish script, for promises and people, and hammered it with ceremonious clumsiness into a post beneath the vine. Mr. Harrow arranged for the tin and the covenant to be kept in the library's safe for the time of the hearing as Exhibit A, then Exhibit B in many folks' hearts. Corbin's men still walked the lane sometimes, and their smiles did not relax even when they were offered tea. But the air between the houses had changed. It now carried the sense that the lane was a shared book to be continued rather than a property to be rewritten. Eli discovered another, subtler alteration in himself. The small rituals he had maintained, the watering can at dawn, the single dusted photograph on the mantel, now had a new significance. They were less acts of preserving absence and more of cultivating presence. He would fill the kettle and think not of what had been taken, but of what he might give. His grief, still a companion, learned new habits. to stand aside from his heart and let it be used as a tool in common labor. Where before he had folded his days into a neat, safe circle that kept everything unaltered, he now allowed himself to move in arcs that involved others. The boy who had been left alone was learning to be a man who could join with others in a cause. There was danger. Still, for the court would come, and Corbin would press his case with all the persuasive arts at his disposal. But the falling action is the place where the hard facts are gathered, and the softer ones gain support. It is where the town's memory was catalogued and made to serve a small jurisprudence of common life. The hearing would require witnesses to speak without flourish, to put into dry language the warmth of a neighbor's kindness. It required courage, quiet courage of the sort that makes the spine straighten when one's voice trembles. Before the court date, there was a celebration of sorts, an afternoon when neighbors gathered to tidy the garden, to plant seeds that would bear witness in other seasons, to lay the congealed threads of their common life like a patchwork across the soil. Eli and his son worked side by side, their hands black with earth and their laughter rare but true. Miriam leaned against the lattice and watched the vine as if it were a map that had shown its lines true. Children ran with the kitten, who had become both mascot and mythic creature of the lane. It is strange how life rewards care with small, oddly stubborn joys. In that afternoon light, Eli felt himself change in a way that had nothing to do with courtrooms and everything to do with love's practicality. He was not heroic in a marquee way. He was a man who had learned to act when called and to trust that the world's small, soft muscles are stronger when flexed together. He had stepped from the safety of ritual and into the risky pasture of acting on behalf of memory. The result was not a sudden coronation, but a slow, patient knitting, a reformation of a life from the inside. When the day before the hearing came, the lane was not a place preparing for combat, but a community offering itself as witness. It was a strange and beautiful mood, defiant perhaps, but not belligerent, resolved, but with room for gentleness. Mr. Harrow walked the lane with the tin in a satchel and the ledger tucked under his arm like a Bible. He would read the covenant into the court record and present the witnesses. Corbin would make his motions and bring his documents. The law would do what it does with impartial hands. But beyond the immediate machinery, an older arbiter, neighborliness and the vine's memory, would be in the margin, watching and, if required, reminding the court that a community is sometimes, in its small ways, the truest custodian of what is precious. As the sun slid toward evening, the lane gathered in a long, humble line, neighbors, children, a smattering of curious townsfolk from further afield. They stood together not because they expected glory, but because they understood a simple equation, that some things are worth the inconvenience of standing up for. Eli, with dirt on his nails and promise purring in his coat, felt the change as a steady warmth in his chest. Grief had softened into purpose. The garden had become not only a place to tend roses, but a place to tend promises. The kitten that had brought the scrap and set him on his feet now walked at his side, an emblem of the small providences that can rearrange a life. At dusk, as neighbors returned to their cottages and the lane folded like a page closed gently, a hand reached for Eli's. It was his son's, firm and true, and for the first time in a long while Eli did not feel the gap that had long divided them. Their journey had not ended. The court would come and there would be further work. But the falling action, the part of the story where consequences of acts reveal their pattern, had done its work. It had unhooked fear from action, had bound people to one another with shared labor, and had shown that a small animal and a folded scrap can be instruments of revival. Before the night grew deep, and before the lane returned to its ordinary quiet, someone, Mrs. Penley perhaps, or the baker, asked a question that belonged to the soul of the story and not to its legalities. Has an animal ever changed your life in a way you didn't expect? It was a quiet thing, not a request for proof but for memory. The question traveled from mouth to mouth, collecting nods, quiet stories, and the kind of small confessions that form the backbone of communal lore. Promise the kitten pranced and accepted pats as if he had always known how necessary his small, whiskered diplomacy could be. The falling action ends when the immediate danger has been managed and the scene is set for the last reckonings that follow. In Larkspur Lane, the reckoning would come in a hearing and in further neighborly labor. But the important human reckonings, repaired relationship, restored purpose, the living vine, had already begun their long, patient work. Eli, who had once counted his days in the polite arithmetic of absence, now counted them in the biology of care. He had learned, to his delight and relief, that tending can be a kind of justice, and that sometimes the right thing is the thing that returns to you not with a fanfare, but with a small blossom. The Lane slept that night with a modest contentment. The tin was in safe hands, the covenant copied, the key kept in Mr. Harrow's ledger for safe transport to the council. The kitten curled like a comma against a child's foot. Miriam stood at her cottage door and watched the vine's leaves catch the moon. Corbin sat at a cafe in town and studied his permit, measuring his next move with the patience of a man who mistakes endurance for inevitability. But for Eli, for his son, and for the neighbors who had come to remember, the falling action had given them what it promised: time, a community strengthened, and the knowledge that promises, when planted and tended, can become living things. Night wrapped the lane, and in the hush a single thought pulsed in Eli like a new beat. He had been given something to guard, not a testament in a court, perhaps, but a living network of hands. The next morning they would go to the hearing. They would stand and tell their stories. The law might be impartial. The Lane's memory had already chosen to be its own judge. The town's hearing opened like an old book laid flat, the pages heavy with ink and memory. People came not merely because a covenant asked it of them, but because they had been summoned by the softer thing that binds a neighborhood, the quiet insistence that someone must remember. The council chamber smelled of varnish and paper, the sort of air that makes small testimonies feel sacred. Mr. Harrow carried the tin in with the deliberateness of a man who understands how fragile objects become anchors. Miriam sat beside Eli. The son's hand found his father's across the bench, as if to assure them both that the world still contained the surprising courtesy of contact. Corbin arrived with his counsel and his packet of permits. He wore his confidence like a second skin, smooth and well-stitched. He had not been defeated in the boathouse. He had only been delayed. It is the practice of men who measure shareholders and square footage to believe time works for them. He intended to let the law do what the Lane songs could not, move slowly but inexorably toward a verdict that suited his brochures. What followed was not a single decisive blow, but a weaving of voices. The son spoke in a voice that surprised him with its steadiness. He told of a small boy whose scraped knees were tended by a neighbor's hands and who learned by these small bargains that the world's kindness is not an accident. Mrs. Penley read aloud a recipe Miriam had once tucked into the jar she had gifted the bakery, a recipe that seemed to those reading it like evidence of a life habitually generous. Children who had chased the kitten under hedges recounted how it had led them to a ribbon, to a note, to the boathouse beam that bore a secret stitch. Mr. Harrow presented the ledger and the witness entries, names and dates that, while not stamped by law, were stamped by living memory. In those hours, law and memory braided. The judge listened with an attention that felt almost like reverence. Legal counsel argued the formality of deed and registry. The town argued for the dignity of a promise kept by hands and plants. Miriam's covenant, read aloud, was not a theatrical flourish but a simple statement. She had given what she loved, not a building, but a patch of care, to the people who had lived with it and kept it in their daily practice. The judge weighed words like a scale and found, to the quiet chagrin of tidy men, that law sometimes bows to living truth when the living truth is given a voice. The verdict was not written in triumphal type. It was a practical thing, a temporary, protective order that recognized the gift and demanded its contents be examined by registry, and that the council consider formal recognition of an easement that would preserve the garden for the community. It was not an immediate coronation, but it was momentum. Corbin left with his papers intact and his mind set on the long game. He would not be thwarted forever. Yet the Lane had bought time, and time is the place where tending happens. Paper can be recorded. Seeds can be planted. The law, in its own tempo, had chosen to hear what a community had to say. When the hearing broke and the crowd spilled back into sunlight, something lighter than victory ran through Larkspur Lane. It was the air of a pocket in which coins had been saved, small economy, domestic and sustaining. People laughed with a kind of relief that comes after strain. Children tossed dandruff of laughter as if to make small confetti. Promise the Kitten darted among ankles as if he had been given a promotion from mere messenger to resident sprite. For Eli, the day felt like a seam mended by many hands. He walked through the lane with the slow newness of a man whose chest had learned to hold more than absence. Miriam walked beside him, her face less a relic and more a compass. The son had become a steady appendage of his life, less a critic and more a collaborator. In the hours following the hearing, neighbors pooled not to celebrate in the way those who win a war might, but to work in the more stubborn theater of tending. They laid out plans for a legal easement, yes, but they also laid down trellises, grafting wire, and new soil for the vine. It was in that soft, hands-on afternoon that Promise made his final, delightful gift. The cat, no longer only a courier but an actor in the lane's slow drama, led Eli and the others to a small curl of earth under the lattice where the vine leaned against the house like a well-read book. The spot had been prepared, a hollow dug by neighbors the night before, lined with the same gentle attention Miriam would have shown. Loose, dark soil, a small mound of compost, a flat stone as a marker. People had gathered with gardening gloves and teacups, with children's laughter threading the adult talk like a flute. Promise did not mew the way kittens do when they want supper. He did what he had been doing all along, moved like an instrument, precise and oddly grave. He landed on the prepared ground and pawed at the mound once, as if to test the soil's willingness. Then he dropped from his mouth, a small thing wrapped in oilcloth that Eli at once recognized. For a beat the world narrowed. The seed pouch Miriam had kept, the small iron tag, the tiny packet of seeds. It had been in her hands not long before. Now it arrived again as if the lane itself were returning what it must. Neighbors gasped. Children peered. The son's hand came down on his father's shoulder with a laugh that might have been crying. Eli reached out and took the packet with fingers that still had soil from the river on them. He knelt as he had knelt so many mornings with the watering can, and in that familiar posture, garden, hands, soil, he felt the old rhythms meet the new. He opened the oilcloth like a man opening a letter from a life. The seeds inside were small and alive with promise. The iron tag had Miriam's flourish on it, and beneath that a single word. Tend. Eli did not speak much in that moment. He pressed seeds into the palm of his hand and felt the small, absurd surge of enormous hope that comes only when one holds life in a palm. The community circled around him, each person an ingredient in the spell. Mr. Harrow with his ledger, Tamsin with children at her feet, the baker with a cloth for knees, the son with his arm around his father. Each contained the same look, the soft intensity of people participating in a living covenant. Eli set the seeds into the hollow and covered them with earth that smelled of humus and the small history of compost. He tamped them down with the heel of his hand and then tied the little iron tag to a stake planted at the head of the new mound. It was a ritual both simple and extraordinary. No lawyer penned an instrument for it. No permit was required for neighbors to sow seeds. The cat sat and watched with the dignified disinterest of one who knows these matters better than men. When Eli finished, he laid a hand on the vine and felt as if it were a pulse, a soft answering thrum. The vine's leaves trembled as if in a breeze that had not come from the wind. Children shrieked and threw bits of ribbon into the air like small improvised benedictions. That evening, a small ceremony was held by the new mound. People brought cups and biscuits. Mr. Harrow read Miriam's covenant again and then read her note's final line aloud, the one that had been written for the one who remembers domestic languages. Plant the seed where the lane is most lonely and tell them it is for promises. It felt like a benediction. Miriam, who had been quiet throughout, placed her palm on Eli's shoulder and smiled in a way that felt both like reconciliation and a benediction of its own. Time, of course, continued to have its work to do. Corbin's legal machinery did not vanish because neighbors had planted seeds. He filed appeals and motions that would test the community's resolve. But the facing of such pressure had another effect. It taught the town how to speak in a voice that could be heard in council chambers and courthouses, a language of witnesses, of ordinary acts catalogued with patience. People learned to translate their domestic memories into evidence. The son learned to transcribe his boyhood memories into testimony, and the lane, its vine and rosemary and the new mound with its iron tag, became both symbol and strategy. Eli's life altered in ways both dramatic and minutely practical. The tidy rhythms that had once been scaffolding for his solitary days became scaffolding for communal acts. He rose early to water the new mound and found company at the gate, neighbors who wandered as if by habit, lingering now not out of curiosity, but out of shared duty. He taught a small boy how to graft a cutting. He and his son learned to speak without testing each other for old hurts. Grief sat at the table like an older guest, not the only guest with a seat that could be offered to others. The house's rooms, which had once resounded with an absence as if a bell had been muffled, now carried new sounds. The laughter of children learning to prune, the low murmur of neighbors planning a community afternoon, the soft purring of a cat named Promise who had delivered a life's turn. The moral of the Lane story unfolded without didactic flair. It was not a sermon, but it had a lesson the way an old fable has teeth. The value of a place is rarely captured by lines on a map. It is measured by the cumulative care of those who live in it. The vine had been a symbol from the beginning, a domestic emblem, a mother's shorthand. It had led Eli not into legal triumph but into relational work, into the practice of tending. Tend what you love, the Lane seemed to say. For tending is the way promises are kept, the way neighbors become family, and the way small acts gather into an argument no paperwork can easily dismiss. As seasons moved, the seed sprouted with the stubborn, patient green of living things. Neighbors marked the first pale shoot as if it were a town anniversary. Children named each leaf and kept tally of its growth. The vine itself, older and wiser, took the new plant into its shade and intertwined them as if to say what the living always says, that the small and the old will find their way together. Eli watched the growth with the quiet pride of a man who had learned to measure wealth not by accounts but by living, breathing proliferation. Corbin, who had put his plans in motion like a gambler placing a bet, found the town less malleable than he had expected. His legal motions were met with the kind of stubborn procedural defense only a community proud of itself can muster. He did not win entirely, but he did not give up. Men of his craft often do not. Yet his campaigns altered in tone. He began to offer compromises. Where once he had spoken of progress as a thin new veneer, he began to ask whether the Lane might be a partner in any development that sought to include rather than erase the memory of what had been. It is a particular grace of unyielding neighborhoods that they often turn would-be erasers into reluctant co-authors. Eli lived the rest of his days, not as a man who had recovered from grief, but as one who had been reschooled by it. Grief had become a tutor teaching him how to be generous in small practical ways. The house kept its rituals, but now the rituals held neighbors as often as ghosts. The son married an honest woman from the Lane who had once been a child in Miriam's Sunday school, and their children learned early that Promise was both a cat and a founding member of a story that began with a scrap of paper. Promise himself aged in a slow way that matches Cat's mastery of time. He took to sleeping in the hollow of the vine every afternoon, sunning himself as if to absorb somehow the warmth of the neighborhood. On some mornings he would set out to deliver a small thing to a neighbor, a lost button, a found ribbon, a scrap of paper that someone had overlooked. He developed, if cats can be said to develop, a personal habit of selecting what matters and presenting it quietly, without demand. In the long view of the Lane's life, Promise had been less a messenger and more a maker of habit. He had sculpted the town's pattern by the smallness of his movements. Years later, when Eli was old and moved more slowly and his hands had the soft tremor of time, people would still tell the story of the kitten that had brought a scrap and the man who dove into a river to find paper. The story became one told over pie and in the dark between bedtime and sleep, with whispered emphasis on the parts children loved most: the gold edge of a tin, the iron key that warmed a palm, the cat that dropped its gift into a gardener's hand. It became a Lane legend, the tale by which newcomers learned that this place guarded its memories like them. It shaped the town's character the way a river shapes a bank, slowly, insistently, with an art that outlasts fast hands. In the spirit of Kipling's timelessness, the final image is not a dramatic tableau but a domestic truth placed like a seed. The ordinary man who had once marked his days with small, private rituals had become a keeper of the Lane's memory. He had learned that promises are not only made in halls of law but in jars of jam, in hands that graft and press, in the small deeds that gather like friends around a fire. He had learned that the world tends to be kinder when people choose tending over calculation. In this, the story resolved into its gentlest lesson, a moral not shouted but lived, that the living work of neighbors keeps promises truer than any stamp, and that love, when expressed in the patient language of care, becomes both law and miracle. Eli's last years were the sort of slow, luminous season that rewards small acts. He planted the vine's cuttings, watched grandchildren learn to prune, and told the story of Miriam and the cat whenever someone asked how a lane came to save itself. On the day he could no longer walk the length of the garden, his son dug a small trench and, with the tender hands of someone who had learned the art of preservation, planted his father's seed packet beside the vine he had tended for decades. Promise, now older and grayer, watched from the lattice like a sovereign, and when Eli finally passed from the lane's care into whatever quiet the world holds beyond watching, the neighbors gathered not as mourners only but as witnesses of a life made, ordinary and divine by tending. They placed a small stone at the head of the mound with the iron tag Miriam had once wrapped, and then placed in Eli's hand the words worn but true, "Attend." And there, in the shade the vine threw across a friendly path, children still play, and a cat named Promise still curls by the roots when the sun is right. The lane keeps its stories, and the vine grows a little more certain each spring, proof that memory, when properly tended, is a harvest that returns in green. You stayed with me till the very end. Thank you. If it felt like a soft purr in your heart, subscribing helps me share more stories like this.